Rupy, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. How are you doing? Thanks for joining us here. I think we're gonna have a good discussion about art and history and how it all intersects.
Yes, I'm
Um,
having some tea also while I do this.
Perfect. I just had a whole cup of coffee, so
Oh,
excuse
good.
my excitement here. But
I am behind on that caffeine shot. I haven't even had lunch yet, so hopefully I'll be awake the whole time.
yeah, I'll be fine. Just a light conversation about Indian miniature paintings, and I don't know if I wanted to do an introduction, or if you wanted to talk about yourself, about your history, about how you started learning how to paint.
Yeah, we
Yeah,
can, we can, yeah, first of all, hi to everybody who's saying hi. Thank you for joining us.
yeah,
Yeah, it was really great actually to connect over these topics that in general for me, I'm just a sucker for the past. And I think one of the first reasons why I got intrigued by miniature painting, but I think most importantly for me as an artist, I came through the traditional path that most immigrant kids take, where you're pre-med first, you do your science degrees, and then you end up pursuing what you really love. So, and
yeah.
shout out to anybody who's in that boat, by the way. But when I started with art, I wanted to be sure that I create work that represents me, my people, and for me, miniature painting was that art form that represents people who look like me. And I think even today, when I'm trying to work with people, I love to make sure that there's representation in terms of the marginalized communities don't get that representation in the arts much at all. So for me,
Right.
representation was so important. And then getting to become a miniature painter was this whole nother journey. But yeah, so I'm today a miniature painter, a contemporary miniature painter, because I'm definitely adding my own 2 cents to it. And also, I would say a very traditional miniature painter because uh,
Right.
I've tried to make sure I learn everything the way it's been done for centuries. Yeah.
That's what
And
I love. Yeah, sorry. Go on.
no, no, it's okay. And I think even today, speaking to you, the thing I'm most excited about is the fact that you also are a traditionalist in some ways, right? And also coming from this pathway of traditional career path and then also doing what you do.
Right. Yeah. I for those who don't know, I originally studied in law. But also before that, I spent time in India. This is the traditional side of learning. I was very lucky enough to spend about 6 months, 7 months with, a very renowned scholar in India, and then, we methodically went through Guru Granth Sahib, and so that was part of my formal training. And then informally, I've known him for many years, and then, whatever questions I have, we can go over text, phone, or when he comes to visit Canada. And so that was like the foundation of my learning, was that traditional way of learning, which was very different than what I learn now. Like now I am in my second year of the PhD, for those who don't know. And the academic style of learning, a language is very much different than when you're in India under the tutelage of, a scholar. For there, when you're there learning from a scholar, it's not so much formalized lessons like, okay, we're going to learn how the verb changes over time. But it's just as you soak in, how the language works, you're picking up multiple things at multiple times. It's a very layered way of teaching, which is quite different than the academic way of teaching in the West now, which is not to say, one is better than the other, but circumstance and just the way people live their lives also changes, right? For a traditional way
Yeah.
of learning, yeah,
Sorry, go ahead. What was the
yeah,
last thing?
I would say like a traditional way of learning requires one to just immerse themselves in that lifestyle. So, learning and the lifestyle go together. You can't separate one from the other. Over here, learning, people compartmentalize it. So it's like you go learn, and then whatever, you come home and you are who you are. Over in India, traditional learning is not like that.
Right. And I think that's what we were chatting about even yesterday. I think that with traditional art forms, and I think one thing that people who are here who might not know what traditional art forms are defined as, which I think miniature painting falls under. And for example, here in the U.S., the National Endowment for the Arts defines traditional art form as something that reflects the life of a community. and an art form that is supposed to reflect the cultural life of a community. So it could be a religious community, it could be a community bound by language. And also the other thing that's very important for traditional art forms is this way of propagating is through demonstration.
Yeah.
It's not formalized, as you said. It's not necessarily from a book or a manual. Even today, when people ask me, "Hey, how do I learn miniature painting?" I mean, there's actually a lack of manuals, and the reason is not because you don't know how to write the manuals. It's the fact is that in traditional art forms or traditional languages like the ones you're studying, or ancient languages and painting forms, you have to learn through demonstration. Somebody has to show you, and kind of a very trivial example I can give you is that, and I don't know if you ever made roti in your life, but whenever you make roti for the first time, you've got to have someone show it to you. It's just see it in a video and just start doing it. You know, it's like many other things that are done with your hands. For example, in miniature painting, it's a very hands-on type of painting form. So I think one thing that I love that we are connecting over this, because there's very few people that I get to meet who are immersed completely in what they're learning. And I know you're saying that you're immersed even more when you're in India learning from the scholar. But at the same time, I'm sure, you know, it trickles in slowly into your life, even in the Western countries when you're living in Canada, for example. So I feel like with this conversation that we're going to have today, it's important that people realize that this is not our job only. Like, so usually I say that, okay, art is my job, but at the same time, even something my mentor said to me recently, she said, you know, I know you're in lockdown. I know you're taking care of your kid. I know you can't paint as much, but it's important now to be a painter without painting. So, so you have to be a scholar even without being able to access those books or something. So it's very important for traditional arts to have that lifestyle immersion, as you were saying.
Right.
Yeah.
What I found really impressive is, you know, the level of depth that you've gone in your learning and in your practice as well. Like, when we first started talking, you were telling me about how you make your own inks, you know, and they're made from like toxic materials and, you know, some traditional way of making your pigments and your inks and stuff like that. And that was just mind blowing, because it shows like the level of, you know, dedication that people have to come. You're not just going to a store and picking up ink, you know, from whatever, you know, Walmart, whatever, and drawing. You know, this is like a very lengthy process you learned over many years. You know, it's a lot of investment, you know, and that's something that, you know, the artist does and the community does by supporting the artist, right? So
yeah, and I think you've definitely mentioned a very key word, which is what I always advise artists to think of art as an investment. It's very important to think of your art career, your practice as an investment. It's definitely about what you're putting into it is what you're going to get out of it. Now, if somebody's hoping to be that one-shot artist who just makes it right away or becomes really popular right away, that can happen. That can certainly happen, but it happens to maybe 2%. The rest of us need to just do our job and need to create for the will and for the purpose of creating, which then again is something you slowly build through this training, right? The one thing I love about being a traditional artist is the fact that my teachers are, you know, when we are even having conversations or even when I'm reading books, it's very much spiritual and devotional. So if somebody has that spiritual germ in them, I think they're more suited for a traditional art lifestyle. For me, I started this out, though, I wouldn't say that I wasn't I wasn't as immersed in the idea of art being a devotional practice. Like, I was like, what? No, I just want to paint what I want to paint. Why do I need to be devoted to it? And I think something that clicked for me was that this knowledge, because it's traditional knowledge, it doesn't trickle down to you right away. Like, it needs to take it. And when it takes it time, it needs to like kind of settle into you slowly, because that's how what we call hand memory in miniature, for example, your hand becomes used to doing things the way they've been done for centuries, but only if you care about it. Like you were saying, that I appreciate that you're noticing the amount of effort I'm putting in to being an artist who's also preserving the tradition, not necessarily just working with it. because that takes a
Yeah.
lot. It takes a
Right.
lot.
No,
I
absolutely. It's like,
It's an easy way, but there's no easy button here. Yeah.
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you talked about it takes so many years and, that memory, that hand memory. I always thought about like learning traditional arts, whether it, be linguistics, whether it be, painting, whether it be music. It's very organic. Like, a seed is planted, it takes a long time to grow and a long time for its flower to come out, and that requires a lot of effort, and, people who maybe don't like the fact that their flower is not coming out within 6 months. Traditional artists study 10 years, 12 years, 15 years, before, coming out with anything, which was, praiseworthy, right? So it takes that time, the dedication.
Humility increases the amount of
Yeah,
years. I joke around with the other traditional artists, and like with some of us, I mean, the humility levels are not increasing sometimes, and you're just like, because you're frustrated and you're struggling as well. It's quite a struggle because
yeah,
when you come from a Western formal education system where the answer to issues or questions is given to you right away, you don't necessarily adopt well to the idea when your teacher just says, it's okay, you'll get it. You'll get it in time. You
right.
still, you're like, wait, you're not a good teacher, So I think that's important to recognize, and I think we both wanted to make sure that the audiences who have tuned in can kind of at least take that as a takeaway, because traditional art forms require a devotion, whereas I think normal art might or might not require it, but traditional art forms definitely require it, especially if you're going to learn things the way they've been done for centuries
Yeah.
and propagate them, but also practice them, I would say, in a more purist way. But one thing I wanted to ask you was that with you and your involvement in your research, because you're more of a linguistic research, right? And while you're doing this research, you're learning so much about a language that you don't speak all the time, a language that you might hear and you might be reciting, but you don't necessarily use it in your communication, right? So
Right.
when studying something like Braj Pasha, right? That's the focus. I
Yeah.
want you to
Yeah.
tell me about that moment when you dove into it, but then you realize, hey, I really love this. I just have fallen in love with it and I really want to do it. If you recall that moment.
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer, because the thing with studying Sikh literature is that, first of all, it's not monolingual. It's not one language, so it's not only Braj Bhasha. There's many other languages that come into Sikh literature. Braj Bhasha is a language that I'm specializing in right now. But I think one of the major times that I realized how beautiful the language was when I started reading the poetry, the Gurbani of Guru Gobind Singh. Guru Gobind Singh primarily writes in Braj Bhasha, and it's just such a colorful and like flavorful language in the way that poetry is written. Not to say that the other writings by the other gurus are not. It's just it's very playful and it's very performative. So, for example, if you see when people perform arti, specifically if you go to India and you see like the traditional learning groups like the Nirmalas and the Hangs, when they recite arti, it's very performative, and they're throwing flowers, they're blowing conch shells, they're ringing bells. And Braj Bhasha is a language that's just performative. It really has this energy to it, and that's why it was.
Engages
Sorry.
your, engages your physicality, right? Like you
Yeah,
physically get. Yeah.
absolutely, and that's why it was primarily used, well, not primarily, but largely used in like warrior poetry and poetry that would pump people up. And I think that this is a big reason why people were so infused with that spirit during the 1700s, 1800s, is that they had this like beautiful poetry that became a daily practice as well. So it becomes part of the nitnem or the daily recitation of Gurbani. And then you have other works like the Furush Prakash, which I'm studying in depth now, and that uses that same poetry. And the beautiful thing about that is, like, once you start reading some of the poetry, then it transfers. So, for example, if you are proficient at understanding Suresh Prakash,
Mm-hmm.
you then are very capable of looking at the writings of Guru Gobind Singh. Not only of that, you can then transfer into, other Braj poetry, like Ananta Das is one that I'm studying over the summer. Other great poets like Sumedh Singh. So it's a language that has so many different aspects. It could be historical things you're reading. It could be devotional. It could be even like love poetry. It could be all sorts of different things. And the diversity that that language specifically has. To going back to your question, I think it really it came into my mind when I started reading the writings of Guru Gobind Singh. That's what really sparked it, I think.
It's really I think, and I'm sure people might be wondering, like, so what does that have to do with miniature painting? And I think what I'm hearing is that with the uses of Braj Bhasha, for example, and the type of flavors and rasas that if it can evoke, I think with miniature painting, specifically for me, because I'm a Pahari painter, a trained Pahari painter, and I think for Pahari, it is, you can divide any type of miniature painting in general into different rasas and different emotions.
Right.
Now, how you categorize them, it could be up for debate depending on who's the historian, right? But also with the application of that, where you have war scenes and you have a lot of devotional scenes and you have a lot of courtly scenes, and just the way, I think what I think is important here to notice is that these two art forms, when linguistically and then painting as a style, they are very much connected to the everyday lives of the people that they were kind of emoting. So, for example, for miniature painting, it was very much a conversation between who the patron is and who the painter is as well. A lot of paintings that might be about Krishna, for example, were not necessarily done by Hindus. Were not necessarily done by one person from one religion or the other. And on the same note, the patrons were also different religions. Came from It didn't have to be specific religion to commission work like that. So I think the idea of that art is something that has been this really close relationship between the patron and the artist, is something we kind of lost over time. But with painting, it's one thing that I think needs to be sustained because it is such a narrative. I remember when we talked the first time, you said you just appreciate the narrative that the miniature paintings kind of embody. And I just wanted to kind of go over, I don't know if we So I wanted to go over like some few, and people asked me this earlier from their questions, was to go over a little bit of an overview of miniature painting.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This is based on what I've learned and what I've read. And so just historically speaking, miniature painting is divided into many schools. There's 5 or 7, depending who you're talking to. I am from the Pahari School of Training because that's who I was able to find and gel with and train with. And then there's, other schools of training across India. The other school I've kind of gotten in touch with earlier is also Mughal school, but it's very different from what I do, which is Gulaid, but it has some influences. We'll talk about it later. But with miniature painting, historically, like this is something with Pahari painting, for example, it's something that kind of was strong from the 1750s to the 1850s. Basically, a lot of the strength of this art form as being the medium of expression of the population dwindled away because of historical upheaval, political upheaval, and social upheaval, primarily colonialism, and a lot of the preferences that became impacted in terms of who was commissioning the work and also what type of work the artist had to evolve into doing. That led to a lot of the loss of the artist, but also the knowledge that was very important. And then, of course, what's happened in that region is also in the Pahari region, which is, the Himachal area. But the painters kind of traveled everywhere. So what else happened in that region that was really impactful to this art form later was definitely partition, which then divided a lot of these Pahari paintings, especially, into 2 different countries. And, access is limited, as you know.
Right.
And also with Pahari, with miniature in general, people ask me, why is it so small? It's not always small. Miniature, and somebody had posted earlier something about frescoes, but miniature is a really imperfect label given to these paintings by historians who are not necessarily from that region, of course. European historians, and their value judgment was based on, what they knew. They gave miniature as a title because they wanted to just differentiate fresco paintings from miniature paintings.
Right.
Paintings on papers versus fresco paintings. So miniature doesn't necessarily mean it's small. These paintings can be really large. And the other thing that I think is very important to note in the history of miniature painting is that the painter is not only the artist, they're also craftsmen, and it was mostly men. They're craftsmen of what they're making. So paper, brush, pigment, binder, everything is familiar to the hands of the painter. And that's one thing that kind of makes it challenging to pursue this lifestyle, this art form now, with this culture of like instant gratification and instant everything and Instagram everything, right?
Yeah.
I think with this, like, these little bits of what's important, is it's important for somebody who's listening or who belongs to a region that miniature painting might have represented once upon a time. It's very important to know that these are the origins of this style.
Right.
Yeah.
Can we speak a little bit more about the locality of the miniature Indian miniature paintings? So you talked about you study under the Pahari style. Now, you said that these painters would travel. So I'm wondering, was the Pahari style only in those regions, or did they travel down south? Did they go out east? Like, can you find Pahari style paintings across India?
The one thing with style was that it was very regionally associated most of the time. I mean, there are some paintings that, and of course, I have not seen every single miniature painting.
Right.
A lot of them are also trapped in collections, but with miniature paintings, they were regionally associated, but there were influences happening. So the reason they're regionally associated is you can imagine that if a king is commissioning a painting, it's done in a certain style, and if I'm the queen who's commissioning that painting, and I hope queens commission them too, but I don't know, we don't have documentation, but I would want mine to look different or better than the ones you're commissioning if you're from a different kingdom.
Right.
So there was certain amounts of, protectiveness over style, but on the same note, though, artists did travel to different kingdoms. It really was the relationship they developed with the ruler, and what type of, commissioning process was happening with the ruler. For example, with Mughal, the Mughal influence came to Pahari, by the 1750s. And that's when Pahari painting changed from this very indigenous art form to then having these Mughal influences, because the rulers were also interacting, right? And the rulers were trying to have some of this cultural exchange happen with other cities. So there are some overlaps and there's influences happening, but on the same note, there were indigenous styles of painting to the regions, which I think are they're very unique, and I say they're really cute. They're really unique. And actually, we can start off with showing some paintings to people. What do you think?
Absolutely. Let's jump in.
So, speaking of indigenous style, and sorry, my camera angle is going to change a bit now, but the first painting I want to share with everybody is this painting, and this is also Pahari, but this painting of Krishna sitting alone. Who's been painted very often, but also has a relationship to Braj Pasha and, to some of the linguistic knowledge that you're acquiring, right? So this painting of Krishna is him, sitting alone. But the first thing I love about this painting is just how bold it is. It's not delicate at all. My first impression of this painting is just that this is something meant to be seen, and it's meant to evoke an emotion of some sort of a strong emotion because of the strong colors used. Now with this is more of the indigenous Pahari style, because you can tell the eyes really big. They're kind of pronounced. These areas right here on the crown, they use beetle wings for that. And there was some really specific things used for each indigenous style. And then this painting is, Krishna sitting alone. But this one thing I love about miniature in general is the fact that the artists were not necessarily loud in the way they expressed emotions, but they really used color, surroundings, and also positioning of the human body to show what the painting's about. So here Krishna's kind of in a daze. He's waiting for a lover, and he's kind of separated from a lover, and this might have been the artist's rendition of the lover itself, but shown as Krishna. And the one thing I really think that's important to notice is the body language that they're showing, with the eyes is just constant, fixed in one gaze. He's holding a flower out as if he's expecting there's somebody's about to arrive. And then also, if you notice this hand right here, it's kind of put gently on his knee, but it's not resting completely. There's like some fingers up as if he's a little bit anxious. Because in this painting, Krishna is waiting. It's really important to notice some of the detailing in this painting, because it is, I think it's quite detailed, but also the artist is not necessarily being super careful. They're kind of just going with it. And that was one unique thing that I liked about the more indigenous styles. And I think, do you want to say something about this painting?
I mean, it's really helpful for the audience to know that there's a specific way of reading these type of paintings. Like when you're looking at it, you're identifying the iconography related to the painting. And, that we talked about how the patron had that relationship with the painter, that the patron also knew this. And most of the audience who are viewing these type of paintings also knew that. But I feel like, this is a skill that now has been lost, for modern Western, a person who's looking upon these paintings. They don't have the skills that they can identify, like, oh, this is what's happening, this is the body language, this is what it's trying to portray, this is the narrative that it's trying to portray. And so it's very useful for you to go into that and explain that for the audience.
I think the other, there's one more painting that I want to show that is kind of, I think it's important to see, because a lot of times people think that miniature paintings are only meant to be these like romanticized courtly scenes. But here's a painting of Krishna, and he's killing the demon Keshi. Now, what I love about this painting is how funny the horse looks. Just from looking at the hair that's raised on his neck and the ruffled tail, and he's literally shitting himself. But the horse, he's in a really bad position. And one thing I love about this that I think kind of relates to miniatures as well is that you can, I don't know if you can see, so Krishna is kind of looking like as if he's flying in the air, and then the horse is on the ground down below. And this is one really strong feature of miniatures, that they're not realistic. They're not meant to be realistic. And it's not because the painters didn't know how to paint realism. It's just because there's some certain spiritual underlyings of, why things were painted this way.
I'd love to go into that, because, that's where I feel there's an intersection between poetry, between the writings in Braj Bhasha, which I'm looking at, as well as Indian paintings, because people sometimes will look at some of the poetry and say, oh, this could not have happened. This is mythology, or this is not how things would work in real life. But I feel like there's an underlying narrative that they're trying to convey through maybe metaphor or simile, whatever it is, whatever device that they're using. In painting now, they're using different devices. Like, obviously, there's something that the painter is trying to show here by him flying, by him having these different proportions, right, than the horse. Is that something that's taught to the painter, that if you need to convey a certain an idea or a feeling, this is how you would portray it, and regardless, if it's realistic in size or proportion or not, like, is that taught to a painter?
Yeah, and I think I missed a part of what you said because the connection was poor for me. But your question is if the paintings were they taught to paint them this way, like unrealistic versus realistic? Yeah, I think there's that's what the painter spends their life learning. Is that, for example, the Gulaid horse, the Kangra horse, the Mughal horse, the Basoli horse that we just looked at, they all look different, but they're all horses, right? But how does a painter know which horse is, the horse they should paint? So for me, I'm a Gulaid painter mostly. For me, there is a part of my training that just was spent doing a horse from scratch with a brush. And knowing really that that is a Gulaid horse, and this horse does look different. So the Gulaid horses tend to have a more neck that narrows upwards when they become closer to the head. But then the Mughal horses have a really wide neck. So these little differences were what the painters were learning, and they were taught. But also you have to understand, in the traditional workshops, painters first didn't start painting. You know, they were grinding pigments for months. My first teacher, Mughal painting teacher, he started learning at 19, and he was grinding pigments for 4 months before he was even handed a brush. You know, and for many of these painters, even in the past, the women in the family were the ones doing all the grinding of the pigments, but they were not allowed to participate in knowing any further of the knowledge, because you know, this is a story, but it was a general belief that women were going to leave the home, like, or daughters especially were going to leave the home, and they were not privy to the knowledge. So then this is the knowledge that was protected, the visual language and how to draw and how to create things. So miniature painters were actually excellent drawers. Like, they were really good at drawing. Yeah, but
just to talk a little bit more about the people who are painting them. Did they come? I'm curious because I found a reference in
all men.
Yeah.
All men.
Did they come from any specific caste groups? Because I found a reference in a text called Gurbalat Pasha Ishemi, which is like an early 18th century text, 1700s, which mentions that a Sikh of Guru Hargobind commissioned these two Turkans, carpenters, to do a painting of Guru Hargobind. And the descendants of Bidhi Chand today claim that they have this painting. I'll share that photo after. But to me, I found it interesting that, you know, these painters, and they identified themselves as painters in the text as well, but they had come from a carpenter background. Did the painters come from various different backgrounds and then become painters, or like how did? What's the story of their lineage?
The painters were like, these were painter families, and I think that's why, you know, became relevant, because all of these people were part of, you know, a specific caste. I mean, I'm not knowledgeable on which caste it was, but I do know that it was very important for this painting to stay within the family, and these were family. And these were, for example, for Nansuk, even, you can trace his lineage all the way to, you know, the descendant today of Nansuk, right? And all of the right? So it was definitely an occupational categorizing of people. And I think painters did end up staying within that occupation until they couldn't, of course, because once the British annexed most of that area, there wasn't really a lot of traditional painting being supported. You know, the British asked for more European style images, and eventually you get the company style as well. But on the same note, the religious patronage, the more patronage of royal scenes was, you know, absent. So eventually that's when I think people started to give up this lifestyle. And then when partition happened, I think that's when also the knowledge just disappeared or was lost because of this movement and displacement of people.
Interesting.
Yeah, but for me, it makes me a little bit, like, it irks me a little bit, of course, because, and this is one big reason why I do what I do, is because there's a lack of female perspectives then, you know, on things, because you don't have female painters, you don't have that perspective, and that's like, you know, half of the worldview is missing. So for me, it's important that when I paint, my view, my female reflection and inflection is very much evident. Because if I don't add that female voice into this art form, then I'm not doing anything to innovate it, to change it. You know, I could just keep painting a lot of men, powerful men, but I think it's time to have powerful women painted as much, because there were many powerful women. They just not painted as often. And Rani Jinda was not the only powerful woman, you know. There were many powerful who needed to be rendered and should be even now rendered. But I think one big thing there is that very often legacies are connected to men. You know, and paintings become a huge part of people's legacies. Legacies are not connected to women, because for us, often our kids are shown or presented as our legacy, but not anymore. Women are very much involved with legacies, but also I think even young women need to think about what their legacy should be. And I think that's how we will get this, not only female patrons more often, but also more female figures painted in these paintings.
Right. No, absolutely. It was interesting. I was doing a little bit of research on a famous Sikh woman named Bibi Amro. And Bibi Amro was the daughter of Guru Angad. And she was basically the reason why Guru Amar Das came into the company of Guru Angad. And it was through her singing. So she was singing Gurbani early in the morning. And, her uncle-in-law, who happened to be Amar Das, turns into Guru Amar Das, hears this, And it's because of that reason that then Guru Amar Das goes to Guru Angad. And it's so ironic, I feel, we don't have any paintings of her in any of the miniatures that I've seen. And perhaps, some of that history has been lost because in Govindwal, a lot of the paintings, the frescoes that they had at that Gurdwara, I believe it was in the late 1900s, it had been whitewashed. So we have lost a lot of our heritage. But it's good that we have people like you who are going to bring that back. And we did get a question about if the attitude of women learning has changed in recent time. Do you feel like it has or has not?
There's a two-part answer to that in general. I ask anybody who's on this live right now, look around you and how many female painters exist around you. Many female painters exist. How many male painters exist? Not that many. How many female painters are the successful painters shown in museums today? Not many. How many male painters are shown in museums today? Many of them. So in general, there is a huge gender bias in the art world. That's like the overarching umbrella that I would say now in general. It's nicer to be a single male who's making, paintings because that's just what you will get shown more and you'll get more work. Now, for me personally, I've experienced none of that, but on the same note, I don't think artists exist in a vacuum. Like if I'm doing well, it doesn't really reflect on my community of artists doing well, right? So it needs to be, everybody needs to move forward together. So that's one note. And the other part of the answer is that there are a lot more female painters or miniature painters in India, from what I've heard and what I've known. There's a lot of students of miniature painter, for example, in Pakistan as well, and they're doing really well, female. But on that note, there is if we come to the diaspora of our community, right, and then we look at within that community, who are the painters, it's mostly the females who are the painters until they're expected to take on that traditional career path, until they're expected to honestly just break down and bow down to the duties of being wives or mothers. And I think it's something that constantly asks the females to sacrifice their passions. But with males, that generally doesn't happen. Now, for males, they have this pressure to, be earners of a significant income, especially in our community where success is so much measured by money and how much money the man also makes in the family, because they think that equates the family standing in society. But on the same note, the male painters are still able to stick to that passion, I think. And essentially, I think with art, it's a game of how often how long are you going to stick to it? Right. It's just that, it's an investment that, are you going to stick with it for 10 years? Something my mentor has said to me earlier, I've always had a lot of mentors. So one of them said, it takes 10 years before you even create work that's worth anything. It takes 10 years of practice before you create anything that's worth anything. That's not shit, So I get really, you can probably tell, I get really sensitive to this fact about female painters versus male painters. The thing is that even within miniature, we need more female painters. We need more trained female painters. We need more trained painters in general.
Yeah.
We need people to invest their life into it, and we need their families to support them. That's one thing our community is really good at, is supporting the people in our in our families. We love our kids, we love our brothers and sisters. Even if they're horrible people, we still we embrace them even if they've done crimes, right? That's the way our community is structured. But on that same note, with artists, when they have a family supporting them for those first, forget 10 years, even if it's the first 5 years, it's what's gonna build our power in art as a community. But I think those 5 years, it'll be torture for that artist because mom, dad will keep asking, "Tu kitne paise banaye?" Like, how much money are you making? Are you selling anything? But that's when the
Right.
resilience of passion and art has to come in. On that note, women are really good at that. We are very, very resilient in that note. We still pursue our passion, even while having like tons of things to be expected of us, which is why I think the women in our community who are artists will actually do well. But there is an important point in their lives when they will, change the structure of their family, which is either getting married or graduating school or having kids. Those are like the points where I see like female painters dropping off, and that's when I get very sad. Those
Right.
where I want to like embrace them and be like, it'll be okay, just stick with it.
Hmm.
Sorry,
Right. Very.
feminist rage has come now, of course.
No, I mean, we talked about this earlier as well, and I thought it was really interesting how we talked about the relationship an artist has with the community, in the sense that an artist, doesn't exist without the support of a community, and it's the community's decision, either consciously or subconsciously, that they're gonna, invest in the arts, and if they don't, that's a decision they're making by, actively making that decision or involuntary making that decision, right? The community decides at the end of the day. If they invest in the painter, if they invest in the musician, if they invest in a scholar, they're building themselves up, and that's a community decision. That's what I think. That idea, like to me, when you said that, I was like, well, that's really interesting. And that's something in the past. The institutions I know from a scholarly perspective, people who studied under scholars, they were supported by the community. That's what the gurdwaras, that's what the bungas, these bungas were institutional learning centers. That's what they did. They provided food, shelter, money, any supplies to students. Nowadays, do we have those institutions? And as a result of not having those institutions, where have we been left, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it's like and I'm trying to think of a community that might be doing this well, right? And there's always examples out there who are doing it well. Now, I will definitely give a shout out to the people who've supported me always, right? I've
Yeah.
had support, but on that same note, I have made sure that, and like, I have, of course, how do I say this nicely? So I have complaints against the community, right, for making sure that they definitely put the arts down. Every time I've gotten a request to show my work in a place that's not for showing art, it's hurtful for me. Like they don't happen anymore because now I've gotten trained in saying no, and it's been years. So they don't happen anymore because they know they'll get a no. But
Yeah.
that's hurtful because I feel like when you have someone who is creating a product, right? For example, even if you were to look at it from a startup frame, like frame of a startup, right? And I am surrounded by engineers, so for me, it's easier to do that. But when you look at a startup, it's going to struggle for a bit before it does well, right?
Right.
And for some startups, they start to do well slowly, and that incline is really, really slow. For some of them, it's very steep. And that's the same thing with artists. And we do have different career graphs. One way is not the only way, right? But on that same note, every artist does need to develop, a community for themselves. One, a community that supports them. For example, when I have days that I absolutely feel horrible about what I've created, coming very close to scrapping paintings and really tearing them up, actually. But those are the days you need that community to come in and be like, just step away, please step away, right? People who support you. Then you need a community to finance your work. You definitely need community to finance your work, but that's also on you as an artist. If you have not proven your skill, your ability, your dedication, your professionalism, then how can you expect someone to put their money on you, right?
No, absolutely.
So in that case, it's both ways. And then there's another community that artists need to build, which is a community for learning. A lot of people in our community have not done that yet. And I think it's just because we haven't thought of it yet. We haven't gotten that far yet. Like many of us have not gotten that far yet, where we're still in that survival mode. We haven't thought that, we need to learn and develop. And I think once that kicks in for a lot of artists in our community, we will have more traditional painter. We will have more trained painters. But a question somebody had asked earlier was that, whether I care about learning one visual language more versus developing my own visual language. I think that's where, for me as a traditional artist, the answer will be very skewed towards definitely learning the visual language really well, and then innovating within it, but with harmony. Now, someone more of a contemporary modern, like a modern art or abstract painter might disagree with me, but this is why this is a discussion on miniature painting.
Yeah. Well, going back into the miniature paintings, we're already at 45 minutes, so I thought we could jump quickly back into some more examples. So we can talk a little bit more about that. And just as an aside, as you start getting the other paintings ready, I want to say that that image that Rupy showed about the Krishna and the horse, that specific episode of Krishna's life is mentioned in the writings of Guru Gobind Singh, actually in the Krishna Avatar, in verse 779. So it describes the same thing about this horse who's opening his mouth really wide. His eyes are really wide. It's trying to scare Krishna, and Krishna just puts his hand right into the horse's mouth. And Guru Gobind Singh says it's basically like he's taken the form of death, and he's like put his hand into the horse, and he's just like taking out the horse's life just like that. And it's a very beautiful line. It even says, the poet says that, I'm thinking about this image and I just love it, he said. So,
that reminds me actually, Jvala, that what you're saying here is so important, because look at like where the story was. So that painting is part of, I think it's called a Rasa Manjari or something, written by this poet called Bhanudatta. And that is also being mentioned in this poetry that Guru Gobind Singh Ji's written. And then that's being read by you and heard by me, and then read in these two different accounts. That's one thing that a lot of historians now are indicating, that there's a huge disconnection between artists and text. Like artists are not reading text, and the text is not reaching the artist. I'm talking about traditional artists here. So when the narratives are being built, right? When the narratives are being revealed and, in these beautiful paintings, the narratives are incomplete because the text is not necessarily a connection, which I think is one thing I suggest all painters to do. Like, read a lot. You've got to read, right? Just like you are deriving meaning from paintings that are accompanying these texts, it's very important for painters to read as well. And you've actually need to go back and read some of the Sanskrit stuff that I need to learn.
This is why I love. This is why I really wanted to have you on, is because my interaction with the paintings has been there ever since I started looking at the poetry. So, for example, when I first saw the writings of Guru Gobind Singh, it was in a manuscript that was held in Ottawa. I think it's in Toronto now. The first page of that Dasam Granth, Swarup manuscript, it had a painting, beautiful painting of the gurus, and there was Chandi on there as well. It was very beautiful. So they go hand in hand together: the painting, the illustrations, and the literature. So
I know you wanted to see this one. So background for everybody, this is where the Pahadi style kind of evolved after Mughal influences. And you can see there's a lot more rendering, like a very, very, very small brush strokes. And now this is the Kangra/Guler style. The categorization depends on the art historian, but this is the style that I learned, and I do. And this is a painting Jvala specifically requested because from what he reads, it's connected really deeply to this painting of Krishna. Take it away, Jvala.
Yeah, there's another beautiful passage where Guru Gobind Singh is writing. This is in verse 232. I'll just read out the verse to you. This is in Krishna Avatar. It says, Lalat tanasani bajave sang basri kadara aur malwa bahagada aur gujri maru aur paraj aur kanada kalyana sobha कुंभक बलावल सने ते आवे मुजरी भैरव बलासी भीम दीप को सगोरी लाकर खाडो प्राण छाए मैं तो गावे कान पूजरी तांते गृह त्याग ताकि सोन तोन श्रोवन में मृग नैनी फेरत सोबान बन उजरी. So it's talking about Krishna, who's on his flute reciting all these different rags. It was saying like Tanasri, Kadara, Malwa, Bhagada, Gujri. It's talking about all these rags that Krishna is reciting. And then it's talking about how all the women, that all of these women now have left their houses, which it shows here, and they've come and they're giving gifts to Krishna, and they're loving the music that Krishna is reciting. And the next verse actually says the beauty in Krishna Avatar is you get to see the personality of Guru Gobind Singh come out, because he says in that, this isn't a Savaya, but he says, "Yam kedo upama tetu mana man vichar tetu sotorum." He's saying that I'm writing this kabit, which I was reciting before, and he was thinking of how to include this simile of Krishna, who's singing this, singing all these different rags. And then it says, "Man uthiyo jagat keh tinake tanalet hai page mano ehe toro." So it's as if like an injured snake is like, I guess like in pain and it's moving all around. That's what like the women were like listening to this music. They were like, moving all about like, just like incontrollably, right? They couldn't control themselves because they were just like infatuated with this music. And it's wicked that it says there that the poet Guru Gobind Singh is like thinking, how do I intertwine this simile into this kabit that I'm writing? A kabit is a specific type of meter that was predominantly used in Braj Bhasha. So, I mean, the images that people paint and the images that people invoke through poetry are the same, and they go together. Often in times you'll see it in manuscript illustrations, so it's beautiful to see that image and put it beside some of Guru Gobind Singh's writings.
Yeah, I think I think from this discussion, like I feel like this is us just starting this discussion too, right? And I was joking with you earlier that now, because a lot of paintings I look at that have not been cataloged, for example, right? And if they're in person, like if you see them, you sometimes, the sad thing is a lot of these paintings have not been cataloged well and have not been taken care of.
Right.
Whether you're at the V&A, they've been cataloged, but also it's still a different way of cataloging that maybe when a Sikh is looking at these paintings would catalog them differently.
Right.
And also cataloging needs to be updated always. But this is what I think, this connection between text and actual image is so important. And one thing that is really important here is also to note that we need not just artists to be created in our community, not just artists to be developed. You need curators, you need linguistics, you need language experts, you definitely need historians, but you also need all these people to talk to each other, right?
Yeah.
We can't have, for example, for me, I don't imagine a cultural conference happening without these components there. I can imagine that cultural conference happening without Bhangra and Gidda, but I cannot imagine it happening without someone discussing, poetry, prose, painting,
right,
and all of these, film, writing, and I'm forgetting dance, right? But there's so many other elements of culture that are lost because we have unconsciously let them go. We think that as diaspora, we'll dig in deeper when we get the chance. But the thing is, these things are disappearing. Like even today, there's paintings that I want to look at in museums in India or Pakistan that are disappearing because they're degrading in quality. I'm not going to be able to see them. That face detail I might need, the gesture detail I might need to see how they're dressed and, what type of trees are around them. All of these things are slowly disappearing because these paintings are now 100 years old. That's
this is definitely beginning.
Bad note.
Yeah, I mean, we can go into that another time as well, but yeah, that's extremely sad what's been happening in the gurdwaras. The committee members whitewashing these old historical paintings, and that's a beautiful thing I like about paintings because they encode a lot of history in them. What people were wearing, the stories related to different gurus of the Sikhs, they describe. So as that gets washed away, we lose like a significant amount of our culture.
And I think that, some people might be thinking that, okay, well, I don't really care about old things. Why should I care about them? Well, if you don't care about old things, start caring about now, right? For example, even now, with one of the things I try to do is that even within miniature, we have so much missing narrative. We don't have partition shown in miniature. We don't have so many of our community events, like 84 is not shown in miniature, right? Like these things need to be captured in our painting style that is familiar to us, that is showing
Yeah.
our people in our own clothes, in our own environments, in our own homes, and the way we live. So I think with me, I try to make sure these missing narratives are coming back. But on that same note, going back to our earlier discussion, the community and the patrons need to also be on top of that
Yeah.
need for
Sure.
narrative. A lot of communities right now who are doing really well in terms of, you know, power in art are, you know, communities are investing into their artists. They're investing into museums that show their art. They're investing into relationships with museums, with galleries, with curators. And I think
Yeah.
that's where, if you're not an artist or if you're not a scholar, if you're not actually doing the legwork, right, there's
Yeah.
this other type of legwork that our community needs to prioritize.
Sure.
And I think forget saying community, like the individuals need to just do it if they really care about it. If they don't care about it, then that's another story. But I think if people do care about it, people who've joined this discussion definitely care about something here. And I think even listening in, and if you're telling a few other people about what you might have heard today, it's still a propagation of knowledge, right? That you and I are sharing and talking about. Should we take some questions? We have a few minutes.
We have about 2 minutes to conclude here. So if you wanted to conclude on any note or show a last image very briefly, this went really quickly this hour.
Well, with people who are actually wanting to ask really burning questions, you can also message us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Trying to message us and ask questions. My concluding note, you know, I think I feel like it's really nice to stumble upon a community where I get to have you as a part of that community, and I get to grow that, you know, learning community that I was talking about. You know, you're part of it now, and I feel like my knowledge of what I do will increase because of what you do. And that takes me to one really important element of art that artists sometimes forget to note, is that art is not about today and this month and tomorrow and this year. Art is about, you know, your entire lifetime. If you're an artist, it's about your entire lifetime. What are you going to make this entire lifetime? What mark you're leaving? How are you changing people? How are you changing your community? And I think that's what people need to think. So art is not about what you need to do today. Survival is what you need to do today, but art is about what you need to do over a long time. And that's what my last sentiment would be, I think. What's yours?
That's a beautiful way to wrap up. I would say, because we have 60 seconds now, but I feel really honored that, you know, we can connect, and, you know, for both of us and the entire community, people in their respective, you know, field need to connect, regardless, you know, if it's art, music, history, linguistics, whatever it is. There are connections between them, because those don't exist separately. They're actually intertwined, you know, and people can specialize in one specific area. That's fine. So to uplift the community, what we all need to do is we all need to get together and whatever, you know, field that people have specialized on, like, you know, make it known, have conversations with each other, because, you know, your own work will get richer if you do that.
Before
we have 20 seconds remaining.
I said before our egos kick in, we need to get on that sharing. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining me. It went by really quickly. I know we had other paintings we wanted to get to, but we'll have to do it next time. Yeah, thanks so much, and take care. Until next time.
Bye. Bye, everyone.